Hi everyone, my name is Fatima and I'll be walking you through how to best navigate the early days of your first tech job. Okay, so I'll start off with a couple of quick questions. With a quick show of hands, how many of you have actually enjoyed your first days at work? Okay, on the contrary, how many of you felt traumatized by your first day and you felt that your experience could have been a lot better if you had received some prior guidance before? Okay. Okay, so first days at work are scary, plain and simple. Even if you're a veteran within the industry, you can't deny it that there's a small part of you that's a bit scared when you start a new job, right? And that's because there's a lot happening. There's new people you have to meet, new projects and technologies you need to understand, documentation to read, tutorials to sit through, and how can we forget the endless HR presentations and paperwork that needs to be filled out. All of this can be quite overwhelming, and coupled with the huge degree of uncertainty and unknowns that you're dealing with can be quite anxiety-inducing as well. Now, there's two reasons that motivated me to talk on this subject, with the first one being that back when I was a student, most of the discussions revolved around how to get a job in tech, and no one really talked about what to do once you actually have the job. How do you actually excel at it? It was just a lot of talk about networking and problem solving and negotiation. Now that I look back, I wonder why this isn't something that we discuss more often. I think we assume that the hard part is just getting the job, and whatever comes after, we can probably figure out ourselves. Similarly, once I started working in the industry, I felt that most of the career-related content that I was coming across happened to be about how to go from one senior level to another, and no one really talked about what to do in the middle. What about the interns and the junior engineers? How do they navigate their early careers? So this is what motivated me to talk on this subject. I decided to put together a list of tips and tricks that I've employed specifically while trying to settle into a new tech role. Throughout this presentation, I've tried to look beyond the first couple of months and prioritize helping you achieve long-term success. Okay. Okay, so now that we've talked about the what and why, let's quickly talk about the who. I'll introduce myself and what makes me qualified to speak on this subject. I'm a software engineer at Yelp, and before Yelp, I was working as a software developer at a trading firm called DRW. Going back even further, I completed 4 internships as part of my undergraduate degree at the University of Waterloo in Canada. So needless to say, I've had plenty of first days at work, some of which I look back to very fondly, and others not so much. Before we proceed, a disclaimer that any opinions or views expressed in this workshop are my personal opinions and do not represent those held at Yelp. Okay, so this is a rough outline of the various focus areas that we'll be discussing in the next couple of slides. We'll start off with documentation. Okay, so most new employees start off by either having a ton of documentation thrown their way or none at all. Instead of being overwhelmed by either of these possibilities, I encourage you to view this as an opportunity. Identify gaps in existing documentation and think about how you could improve it for the next engineer that gets onboarded. This not only shows initiative on your part, but also demonstrates that you're committed to improving existing processes within your team. In my experience, I've seen both ends of the spectrum in the sense that I've been on teams that had no documentation whatsoever, but I've also been on teams that were very diligent with keeping their documentation up to date. With the former, your path is pretty straightforward and you can work on creating that missing documentation, but with the latter, you can always think about ways to improve what already exists. Sometimes too much documentation in the written form can also feel a bit intimidating for people, especially new employees, because you already have a lot of reading to do, and some things might just be better explained through other mediums, like say a video tutorial or a screencast. So this could be something that you could potentially look into. Now, there's a reason why I decided to talk about documentation first. In the first couple of weeks at a new job, you likely won't have any project-related tasks assigned to you yet because you're still being onboarded. Now, you can call me impatient, but I always find this to be a very frustrating experience because I feel like I'm not yet contributing to the team, so what value am I really bringing to the table? If this is something that you struggle with as well, working on improving documentation can help you feel a sense of accomplishment, and trust me when I say that your contribution will be greatly appreciated. Documentation is always one of those things that engineers generally dread doing, but if done right, can be indispensable. Next, let's talk about the art of asking questions. In his 1936 classic, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie advised that you should ask questions that the other person will enjoy answering. Not asking the right type of questions is truly a missed opportunity, but before we get into that, I will highly encourage you to look into whether a buddy will be assigned to you when you're starting out. This is a fairly common practice at companies, and the purpose of a buddy is to help you out in any way as you get onboarded. I found this to be incredibly helpful because you basically have someone that you can direct all your questions to, and you don't have to go around trying to find the right person or team. Now, coming to the art of asking questions, this is something that I've thought long and hard about over the course of my career and still do. While I firmly believe that asking questions should always be encouraged, it is also necessary to do your homework before you go ask those questions. What do I mean by homework? Well, for one, do your research. Do a quick Google search and gather as much context as you can. Go to Stack Overflow, search through existing documentation. Use all the available tools at your disposal. However, something very important to keep in mind is to time box yourself. You have to be mindful of maintaining that balance between doing your due diligence, but also keeping project deadlines and deliverables in mind. You no longer have the same kind of luxuries as you did in school, where you could spend days working on assignments. There's project deadlines that need to be met and stakeholders that need to be reported to. Again, different problems will require you to assess the situation differently in terms of how much time you should devote to the problem, but ultimately you're a better judge of this. Secondly, as someone whose first language isn't English, I'd also recommend talking things out loud before you go ask your questions. In my experience, I've often found that, especially when I'm struggling with something difficult, I can be thinking in one language, which is most likely my native language, but having to explain it in another, and doing that translation might not necessarily be as straightforward. Also, when we're struggling with something, it's very common to have a lot of scrambled thoughts, which might make sense to us, but might not necessarily make sense to a third person. So my suggestion is to always sit down, gather your thoughts, write them down if you have to, and talk it out loud, just so you're sure that when you're explaining your thought process, it's flowing as intended, and someone listening would be able to follow your train of thought. This is basically the rubber duck technique, which is a fairly common practice used by developers while debugging, with the concept behind it being that sometimes explaining your thought process to a third person or talking it out loud can be very helpful in getting to the solution. This is also a testament to your excellent communication skills. Next, be respectful of people's time. Please don't be that person who's constantly nagging other people on Slack or Teams. Even if you're reaching out to someone like your buddy, please be cognizant of the fact that while they are helping you out, they also have their own day-to-day tasks to complete. So try to approach this a lot more methodically. I used to write down my questions and then set aside some time with my mentor where I could talk to them. Instead of repeatedly asking for help, you can also share a compiled list of the questions that you have, and your mentor can get to them when they have the time. Alternatively, you can also schedule a quick 15 to 20-minute video chat, especially if you want to share your screen, which is, again, a great way to showcase your findings and the work that you've done so far. I find these approaches are a lot better because this way you get someone's undivided attention instead of bothering them every couple of minutes when their attention might be elsewhere. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I've made these suggestions, with the biggest one being that they really help you deal with imposter syndrome, which can be a very common feeling when you're first starting out. When you start a new job, you don't have all the answers yet. In fact, you have more questions than answers. You rely on others to help you learn the ropes. While this is completely expected, sadly, imposter syndrome knows no rhyme or reason. It strikes in the unlikeliest of scenarios and can make you feel very debilitated. But making these little efforts can go a long way in helping you feel more accomplished and empowered against imposter syndrome. When you go ask questions, having done your research and well armed with some background knowledge, you will feel more in control, more accomplished. It's always helped me feel a lot better about my skill set in general because I know that I've done everything in my capacity to answer this question. Secondly, it reflects positively on you as a new employee because it not only demonstrates that you're resourceful and know how to dig for answers, but it also shows the other person that you're respectful of their time and you're not just dumping your questions on them and you've given the questions some critical thought before. I also looked into some research that has been conducted on this subject, particularly by 2 professors at Harvard Business School. Having researched the matter extensively, they recommend some best practices when it comes to asking questions, which includes the importance of asking follow-up questions. Follow-up questions signal to your conversation partner that you're listening, you care, and that you want to know more. People interacting with a partner who asks lots of follow-up questions tend to feel more respected and heard. They also suggest getting the sequence right when it comes to the questions that you ask. Good conversationalists understand that questions asked previously in a conversation can influence future queries. For example, some researchers at the University of Southern California found that when the question, how satisfied are you with your life, was followed by the question, how satisfied are you with your marriage, the answers were highly correlated. Respondents who reported being satisfied with their life also said that they were satisfied with their marriage. However, as soon as you flip the order of these questions, the answers were less correlated. Next, let's look into getting started on your technical projects. Now, over the course of my past work experiences, I've put together this rough checklist of tasks that you should try to complete before you get started on your projects. I encourage you to look into these tasks before you get started on your first task, because it just helps you avoid unnecessary bumps in the road ahead. Firstly, if there's no documentation for the project that you're starting on, which is a situation that I've been in, try to see if you can identify the previous or current project owner and understand basic project setup, which includes things like setting it up, deploying it, testing it, etc. Secondly, in terms of the integrated development environment or IDE, identify your team's preference. You're absolutely free to use the IDE of your choice, but using the same IDE as your team can help, especially when it comes to debugging, since the choice of IDE does impact debugging, with different IDEs offering varying degrees of debugging support. On the subject of debugging, understand how to do it, and I just don't mean using print statements, not that there's anything wrong with that approach. You can look into using something like breakpoints, and again, this is a great opportunity where you can leverage your team's experience. Next, understand testing requirements. Again, this is really going to depend on the scope of your project and general team practices, but the earlier you figure this out, the more confident you'll be in terms of the changes that you push to production. Tying in with testing requirements is also an understanding of the deployment process, and this can also really vary based on the company, team, etc. But however informal or formal it may be, make sure you understand how your changes get deployed to production, what the deployment pipeline looks like, how to safely deploy changes, what to do in case of failed builds, how to roll back faulty changes, and lastly, how to actually test your changes in production. Next, make sure you understand how tickets are documented and the level of detail that's expected. You can expect to see a lot of variation here. In some companies that I've worked for, we were expected to document our ticket every day with the progress that we'd made, but in other companies, that level of detail might not really be required. Given everything that I just mentioned, a very useful all-in-one exercise that you can do in the first couple of weeks is to either shadow another engineer or do peer coding sessions. This will allow you to observe the entire process end-to-end, from the moment a ticket is assigned to an engineer all the way to the very end when it gets deployed to production. Another thing that I'd like to mention is that in the first couple of weeks, you'll mostly be doing a lot of readings, watching tutorials, and this could get slightly frustrating. At least for me, I start getting a bit flustered when I'm not actually getting an opportunity to tinker with the code, and I'm just expected to focus on the theoretical side of things. To counter this, you can ask your manager to assign some starter tickets to you. Starter tickets are usually very minor tasks, like a code cleanup or adding unit tests, but they allow you to actually get your hands dirty, which not only helps improve your understanding of the code base, but also gives you a sense of accomplishment, which is a very encouraging feeling in the first days of a new job. Before we move to the technical side of things, something that I want to stress on is the importance of communication when you're stuck. This is something that is very likely going to happen, especially in the early months, and as frustrating as this can be, this is where your communication skills will really shine. Be transparent about your blockers and your progress. Even if it's something as trivial as permission issues, which is a fairly common blocker for new employees, make sure that your manager is aware. Don't wait until the last day to report if something will be delayed. Again, this isn't like school where you can just email your professor on the last day and expect to get an extension. Delays in your projects push a lot of other things forward as well. So make sure that you give your manager enough time so they can convey these delays in advance and to other stakeholders as well. And lastly, don't forget things like thoroughly testing your code or documenting your code just because you're in a rush. Okay, moving on, let's dive into the technical side of things. Now, this is something that I've personally really struggled with, and I've actively worked on changing my approach as far as diving into the technical side of my project work is concerned. When I first started out as an intern, I would go in with a very focused mindset of what I wanted to learn. I would have a laser-sharp focus on what my project was and what I was expected to do, but I would completely turn a blind eye to everything else. Over the years, as I've grown in my roles, been assigned more responsibility, and worked on projects on a much larger scale, I've realized that turning a blind eye to other or adjacent projects might not be the wisest decision. First and foremost, I think it really impacts your understanding of your own work. I was really naive to think that I could be a good engineer if I focused exclusively on my own project, because that's just not true. You should take out the time to understand other services that your project might be interacting with. You don't need to get into the nitty-gritty, but try to have a basic understanding. I can assure you that this will not only allow you to perform better at your role, you'll also feel more at ease at the company. A very common experience that new employees undergo is that they feel lost and they feel this sense of disconnect with the rest of the company, which is a very natural feeling, especially if you're working at a large company. I'm someone who develops a sense of exclusion very quickly, so when I moved to Yelp, which was a significantly larger company to my previous one, I made it a point to understand the big picture. Not only did I work on developing an understanding of my own project, but also of other adjacent projects. In my first couple of weeks at Yelp, I sat down with various engineers on my team and asked them to give me a bird's eye view of what I was going to be doing, what the overarching goal of the project was. This was incredibly helpful because not only did I get varying degrees of explanation based on how senior the engineer was and how long they'd worked on the project, it really deepened my understanding of what I was going to be working on. I would go into these meetings with the goal that I should leave with such a thorough understanding of my project that I should be able to explain what I do to a stranger on the street. Architecture diagrams can really help in this scenario as well, especially if you're trying to understand how different services interact with each other. Another thing that I did was to ask my tech lead to explain to me at what point my work came into the picture from the moment a user opens the Yelp app and searches for something. Asking questions of this nature helped deepen my understanding, and I think it's helped me become a better engineer and feel more connected to the company and its goals overall. Next, let's look into the subject of establishing expectations. For the longest time, I used to think that all I needed to do was do my best and be a good employee. I figured that if I was doing the work, meeting goals, and no one was complaining, that should be good enough, right? Wrong. If you want to get ahead, you have to be strategic with your career. You can't just outsource it to people's goodwill and hope that just because you're doing what's expected of you, you'll get promoted or you'll get that raise that you've been eyeing for the last couple of months. Establish a clear criteria the moment you start a new job. Again, this will look very different based on the company. Some companies can have a very well-defined criteria, while others might barely have one. It's on you to determine which of these categories your company belongs to. If you're part of the former, good for you, because some of the work has already been done for you. But if it is the latter, I very strongly suggest that you sit down with your manager in the first couple of weeks and establish and unanimously agree on a criteria. In either case, make sure that you thoroughly understand how you're going to be evaluated and what sort of measures are being used. In my first full-time role, I remember walking out of my first performance evaluation feeling more confused than relieved or even happy. I had no clue what the conversation had been exactly like. There was no clear criteria that had been established by my manager. The whole conversation had been very vague and very hand-wavy, and I left the meeting feeling very, very confused about how I had done, right? There had been no indication towards either my strengths or my weaknesses or things that I could do to improve if I was lacking anywhere. And I just left the meeting feeling very, very unsatisfied. At first, it was easy to attribute everything to my manager because the new employee in me thought that this was their job, not mine. But over time, I started to realize that I couldn't just take a back seat as far as my performance evaluations are concerned. You can't just do good work and expect that it will be enough. You have to actively take part in these conversations. You have to make sure that your effort and contributions are being noticed. Anything from regularly contributing to technical design conversations to setting up socials for your team, make sure that your work is being acknowledged. Tying into establishing expectations is also the importance of actively seeking feedback. Don't wait until your formal performance evaluations every 3 or 4 months to find out how you're doing. Actively set up a feedback loop with your manager. Try to have regular conversations where you're seeking feedback. Seeking feedback can be very scary. There's no denying that. Recently, my tech lead left to join another company, and this was someone that I was absolutely in awe of. I thought they were so cool and so smart. I'd also worked with them on my very first couple of projects at Yelp, so they had a pretty good idea of my technical ability. But I never asked them for feedback, and now since they were leaving, I told myself that, okay, I'm never gonna get a better chance than this, so I mustered up the courage to ask them to share some very candid feedback, absolutely terrified of what they would have to say. To my surprise, the feedback was nowhere close to as bad as I had imagined it to be. We discussed some ways in which I could improve, but later on I kept thinking to myself how much more useful this conversation had been if I had sought out this feedback earlier and more frequently. I had a similar experience at one of my internships as well, where I just relied on doing good work and occasionally asking for feedback. I saw the same red flags in terms of very vague feedback being shared and no clear benchmark being established, and lo and behold, 4 months later, when it was time to get my formal evaluation done, I was on the edge of my seat the entire time because I had no idea what to expect. Try to avoid situations like these and be strategic about your career trajectory. Moving on, now let's touch upon the subject of working in distributed teams. The workplace has really evolved over the past couple of years, and working in remote distributed teams is now a norm instead of a rarity. I have a couple of tips to share to help you navigate working in distributed teams. First of all, establish core hours. These are basically a set of hours that your team will unanimously agree upon, and the understanding is that everyone will be online during these hours, and any meetings that get scheduled will only be held during these hours. This is pretty convenient because it just helps you plan out your day well in advance. Set your core working hours on your calendar as well, because again, this just helps people schedule meetings. Be mindful of people's time zones and lunch hours. In the virtual world, we obviously need to make a greater effort to maintain social interactions. I'm a big introvert, so socializing doesn't come naturally to me, but you can make these little gestures that really go a long way in helping make the work environment a lot more friendlier. When starting meetings, exchange pleasantries, ask people how their weekend was or how their day has been so far. This just helps breaks the ice, and it helps you build a more personal connection with your team members, which goes just beyond work. Similarly, you can also suggest setting something up periodically. It doesn't have to be too formal, something like a quick 30-minute virtual get-together every couple of weeks, just for some casual chit-chat or even to play some fun virtual games together. Little things like these really help bring a team together. If we're talking about working virtually in remote teams, there's no way that we can't talk about the importance and absolute crucial nature of establishing a work-life balance, which brings me to my last slide. I'm going to preface this with a quick statistic. According to the Harvard Business Review, the psychological and physical problems of burnt-out employees cost an estimated $125 to $1 in those hours, given the hustle culture narrative that we're fed 24/7. And I will think about establishing a work-life balance later on. This could not be further from the truth, because a work-life balance isn't just magically going to be created for you. And this is something that you need to actively and very diligently work on. This has also been established by researchers who suggest that a work-life balance isn't a one-time thing, but rather a cycle that we must engage in continuously as our circumstances and priorities evolve. Now that I look back on how my understanding of a work-life balance has evolved over time, it's actually funny because my mom's a professor of organizational behavior at a Canadian university. Organizational behavior is basically the study of human behavior within the context of organizations. So a lot of her research happens to deal with the work-life balance, work-family conflict, among other things. So thanks to my mom, I was aware of these concepts well in advance, even back when I was an undergrad. However, I was very naive at the time, and whenever she would talk about the importance of a work-life balance, I would just brush it off. I used to think that it's the start of your career. So what if you have to work a couple of extra hours instead of your usual 9 to 5? So what if you have to work a couple of extra weekends? But that was me speaking from a place of privilege. Obviously, when you're a student, you're not really thinking along those lines. When I started working full-time, again, I was privileged enough not to be on a team that was super stressful. And once again, I was unknowingly reaping the benefits of a work-life balance. I had it, so I took it for granted. Now, two major things happened when the pandemic hit. One, obviously, I started working remotely, just like everyone else. And secondly, I changed teams, and this new team that I was on, as much as I enjoyed it, was a lot more stressful. I was working for a trading firm at the time, and this new team was at the heart of trade execution, so there was always a lot of pressure and very, very tight deadlines. Before the pandemic, I would go to work in person, and I would never bring my work laptop home. And this wasn't exactly a conscious choice. I just didn't need to. Like I said, the previous team that I was on allowed me certain privileges, and this was just one of them. This was easy to do in person, but the moment I started working virtually, the separation between work and the other parts of my life started to blur, and I felt that I just couldn't, for the life of me, get rid of my laptop. It seemed to follow me around. There was always one last Slack message that I needed to respond to, or one last email that I needed to read in the middle of the night. And lo and behold, a couple of months into working virtually, I started experiencing burnout symptoms, and I realized that I no longer had a work-life balance. Now, the thing about being overworked and not having a separation between work and the rest of your life is that it very slowly creeps up on you. It starts with you checking your email after hours and then slowly makes its way to you working over weekends and feeling perpetually exhausted. So, to help you avoid a similar situation, here are some tips. Turn off all notifications, emails, and set yourself to offline. If you're someone like me who can't help checking messages once you've been pinged, pause your notifications so you don't even get pinged. Again, this is easier said than done. A friend of mine doesn't have any work-related apps on their phone, and they always seem to be so much more at peace. But again, this isn't a luxury that everyone might be able to afford, right? Especially if you're an on-call engineer, obviously you need to have certain apps on your phone. Do not work weekends. Like I said, it starts with you working one weekend, and the next thing you know, you're working most weekends. Whatever it is, it can wait until Monday. If you're on call, understand your company's policy surrounding that. Some companies offer monetary compensation, while others might offer additional time off. Use this time. Don't think that you'll be a good employee just because you're not using any of your paid time off or vacation days. You might be able to do this for a short while, but you'll burn out eventually. Not using your benefits like your paid time off and vacation days and wellness days really shortens your longevity at work, and your days just start becoming into one big blur. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them right now, but thank you for attending the session today. Yeah. Okay, so the question is that, are there any resources that I can recommend for like team building activities, especially for like remote teams, right? Off the top of my head, I don't know any, but just things that I've seen in other companies. Like I have a friend who works at Mozilla, and I know they have like workations every quarter where like the team sort of assembles in like this one nice vacation spot, and they're basically working that week, but they get to sort of do it in person. Something that, again, I've seen at Yelp is that we have these socials every 2 weeks, which is, again, they're done virtually. That's one other thing that I've seen. But no, I don't know any resources off the top of my head. Yes. Okay, so the question is, when you're in a new environment, how long does it take for you to like become confident and start contributing to technical conversations? I'll say there's two aspects to that. First of all, like any company that you start in, there is an understanding that it's going to take you some time to just settle into the team and get to the point where you're now like contributing, you're a regular contributor. So again, that really varies on the company. For example, at Yelp, that understanding was like about 6-ish months. Like the first 6 months is kind of just for you to settle down and understand the processes and everything. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing that I would tell you is that there's really no right answer to that. There's really no right time where you can be like, oh, okay, now I'm going to start contributing to conversations. Even if you don't have anything meaningful to say, I think asking questions is a great way to demonstrate that you're listening, right? Like you're listening, even if it's a meeting where you feel that, okay, you're completely out of your depth, ask questions. That's a really good signal to the people there that, okay, this person is listening, right? But there's really no perfect time after which you're like, okay, now I know exactly what's happening. Yes. Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Uh, yeah, that's a great question. So the question is that, especially in the beginning, how do you communicate, especially when you're up against a blocker? I would say that's like I don't think there's one right answer. I think it's very subjective. It depends on how big the problem is, right? It depends on how close is your deadline, right? For example, a very recent project that I've been working on is like, it's a very high stakes project. There's a lot of other teams involved, and we have like a couple of team syncs during the week. So with a project like that, and that also, one other thing that I want to highlight is that project has been delayed for a while now. So obviously people are very concerned about this project, right? So with a project like that, as soon as you come across a problem, I surface it, right? I think that's very important. In terms of, like I mentioned, it's important to time box yourself, but again, that depends. That's where your assessment as an engineer is gonna come in. That, okay, how big is this problem? How much time do I think this problem needs? The time boxing thing is actually something that I've seen a lot of on-call engineers do as well. Especially when there's an outage happening and you've just been paged, time boxing makes a world of a difference, right? Because when there's an outage, your business is potentially losing money by the second, right? So you have to be very, very quick to assess, okay, what is the risk? How do we mitigate this risk? But again, that's a very, there's no right answer. It's a very subjective sort of a thing based on the situation, based on the problem, based on how big the risk to the business is. That's what I would say. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's a great question. So the question is, when you're is trying to establish a benchmark for your performance, what sort of examples were given? Um, so so from what I've seen at Yelp so far, I guess I'll quote them. They have a very clear criteria established, which I really like. There's like a couple of high level categories that they have. Like for example, there's your technical skill set, there's your communication style, there's your collaboration style, right? So they have these high level sort of categories that they've established. And then for each sort of level of engineering that you're at, they'll provide like examples of, okay, this is how you're going to demonstrate that you're, let's say, an L2 engineer right now or an L3 engineer. So it's things like that. Do you want like specific? Uh, uh, So I think like for example, an L3 engineer at Yelp, and again, this will really vary based on the company. Something that I've found is that these leveling in terms of the engineer that you're at can be very different based on the company. It's not a one-to-one sort of a thing. But for example, like a senior engineer at Yelp should be able to write like a technical document. They should be able to put that together, right? They should be able to drive forward technical conversations. Um, yeah, something like that. But yeah, honestly, with the establishing a criteria and the benchmark, I've talked to a lot of like my colleagues as well at other companies. I think it's something that we're still like it's a difficult conversation. I especially I think for me, as I'm now trying to get to like this senior role, I think as you become more senior, the conversation gets even more vague. Like I think it's a lot more straightforward up to the point you get to senior. Then I think after that it's just so vague. No one really knows what you need to do to show that okay, you're ready to be a senior now. You're ready to be like a staff engineer now. Um, so I think yeah, in general there seems to be a lot of vagueness around this conversation. Yeah. Yes. I think so. The question is that as I was coming out of my undergrad, were the company that I was a part of, were they understanding that I'm just starting out and I'm not? I think I think that's part of the understanding, right? So as in like expectations for a new grad engineer are going to be very different for compared to the expectations for a senior or like a mid-level engineer, right? So like companies usually are pretty understanding of that. One benefit that I had was that my first full-time role like basically was an internship that I then converted to a full-time role. So that sort of helped because I'd worked with those people, with those teams. So that helps you onboard very quickly, right? Because you already have a lot of that context and a lot of that background. Um, But generally companies are like pretty understanding that, you know, you're ramping up, and they give you that time, and they give you that space to, you know, get to a point where you're contributing. So yeah, I would say that usually they're pretty understanding. Yes.
Any tips on how to kind of come up with topics for one-on-one?
Oh, that's a great question. So the question is how, like, do I have any tips for what to sort of discuss in a one-on-one? I think one thing that I've definitely seen when I've chatted with like younger engineers is that they sort of don't realize that not using your one-on-ones is like a wasted opportunity, right? First of all, I really don't think that a point of a one-on-one, let's say you're having a one-on-one with your manager, I really don't think the point of a one-on-one is to communicate what the status of your project is. Your one-on-one is like, as the name implies, one-on-one time with your manager. Your manager probably already knows where the project is, right? You're gonna have other meetings, other project-related meetings, or other project-related syncs during the week. So don't waste your one-on-one by just repeating those same project updates. Um, Other like things that I like to talk about, one, like I mentioned, feedback, right? Now, even with feedback, be strategic with how you sort of structure that question. Don't just go up to your manager and be like, oh, can you share some feedback on how I've been doing? Like I said, the more sort of focused and specific your question is, the better answer you're going to get. So if you just like give someone like a blank slate that, oh, give me feedback, that's going to be very difficult for them to answer, right? You can ask them something like, oh, based on, you know, this project, do you mind sharing some feedback in terms of my like design skills, right? Or how do you feel I've been doing in terms of communication, right? So ask them very specific questions. You can also use your one-on-ones to talk about future projects that you might be interested in, right? Something that I've definitely learned over time is that, especially at larger companies, project planning happens way in advance. Like if there's projects that your company is gonna do next year, those discussions are like already happening. So I tend to use one-on-ones to express my interest in future projects, right? Because like the sooner you express your interest, the sooner your manager is aware, and then, you know, when they're, you know, deciding what people are going to be assigned to what projects, they'll know that, okay, you know, this person is interested. So that's another thing that you could do. Yeah, that's what I would say. You can also, yeah, you can also, yeah, I think future projects, feedback, yeah, that's pretty much, yeah, that's pretty much what I like to sort of talk about. I'd also say that like don't force your one-on-ones. I think like that's something that I really like about Yelp is so every week I have one-on-ones with my engineering manager and then my technical lead. Sometimes if you feel like you don't have anything to talk about, it's okay to let them know, and they're usually pretty open to that. Like your one-on-one is meant to be sort of dictated by you. So you get to decide the frequency of it and what the theme of your one-on-one should be like, right? So don't force it. If you feel that, okay, like this week I don't really have much to share, let your manager know. I don't think they're gonna like force you to have a conversation with them if you don't have anything to say. Any other questions? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming to talk to me.